Hello and welcome to our webinar on Apricot Secure Web Forms, 7 use cases and 6 tips for setup. We appreciate your interest in today's topic and your interest in making the most of your Apricot system. Appreciate you joining us today. My name is Jeff Hegwood. I'm an Apricot software consultant at Sidekick Solutions. Sidekick Solutions is an independent software consulting company. We specialize in Apricot software. We help new and existing Apricot users set up and streamline their Apricot software systems. We do this with a range of professional services from implementation to reporting, consulting, data migration, and database audits and cleanup. We've been working with Apricot software for about 4 years with nonprofits, collaboratives, and public sector organizations all across the spectrum, large and small. And across that spectrum, I'm excited to share some of what we've learned and some best practices that you can implement in your own Apricot system. For a little geographical context, I'm presenting today from Spokane, Washington. That's right on the border of Washington and Idaho. This is where I live and work. And we have attendees on this webinar from across the US, as well as some international attendees as well. So we have a lot to cover today, so let's take a quick look at our agenda. During this webinar, we're going to walk through the steps to set up a secure web form in Apricot, review some best practices for secure web form implementation. One of the more intriguing parts of this webinar, which I think you'll be excited about, is we're going to look at some use cases and ideas for secure web forms and suggest some ways that you might get more out of this feature. After we've taken a look at best practices and use cases, we're also going to look at some alternatives to secure web forms. Secure web forms aren't a solution in all cases, and in those cases where they're not a fit, we need to find some alternative options. And at the end, we'll wrap up with key takeaways and open it up for some questions. So my goal with today's presentation is to spark ideas that might apply to your Apricot system. Now, some of these ideas may be a fit, some may not. We're going to cover a lot of ground in the presentation, but I do want the concepts to stick, so if they ever come up, you can apply them to your own database. To help with that, you're going to receive an email following this webinar with a recorded video of today's presentation and a link to the slides, which you can download. In addition, we're going to open up the conversation at the end for questions. Those can be related to Apricot Secure Web Forms or any other Apricot-related topic. So we expect the presentation to finish before the 60-minute mark, so there's going to be plenty of time for questions. And I'm happy to stay as long as there are questions to be answered. So as long as you're willing to stick with me, we can continue to answer questions and make sure that all of your topics are covered. So let's dive in. So what is a secure web form and how does it work? Secure web forms are publicly accessible Tier 1 forms in your Apricot. These Tier 1 forms are accessible via a direct link, a URL, or they can be embedded within a web page on your website. Secure web forms collect data through an Apricot form and then enter those submissions directly into your Apricot database. There's no middleman and no in between. Each submission becomes a record in your Apricot, just like records created by users who are logged into your database. Anyone can enter data through an Apricot secure web form, which makes them inherently flexible, even those without an Apricot login. So for example, you could issue secure web forms for clients, volunteers, or maybe even community partners to fill out. Apricot secure web forms are single use. They have no login privileges to your database, which means web form users cannot access any data in your database at any time during their web form session. Once a secure web form is submitted, that user is kicked out of that form. Basically, they complete it, and they must re-enter that form if they're to enter a new record. This makes secure web forms, quote unquote, secure in terms of separating them from your Apricot database. So why are secure web forms important? Why do we use them at all? So secure web forms are available as a standard feature in Apricot, but we often find the feature underutilized or completely disabled or inactive, not even turned on. Apricot secure web forms can improve your organization's Apricot experience, and you should consider web forms because with them you can spend less time on data entry by letting others do that data entry work for you. Engage with clients and constituents online. And then one of the most important is eliminate paper-based processes and tools. Things like shuffling paper around the office, using a fax machine to accept referrals or other documentation. Web forms can take the place of many of your paper-based procedures that you may be using now. So these benefits will become more evident as we review practical use cases for secure web forms and how they'll save you time and effort on data collection. But first, let's build one. Let's actually go through the process of putting together a secure web form and cover some of the best practices to consider when implementing secure web forms. Setting up a secure web form is relatively straightforward. There's a set of steps that you can follow for each new web form, and if you follow these steps, you can publish them to your website or as a standalone form. So let's walk through these steps one by one in a quick demo. Most of what I need in my demo database, which I'm going to show you here, is already set up. So we're going to skip over some of the creation steps because we want to use the created components to display some more advanced features later. But the process for setting up a web form follows a similar path to what you're going to see here. So the entire process starts with a Tier 1 form, and that occurs on the administrator side of the database. Now I've already created a Tier 1 form, and I'm calling this form my survey. Creating a form is maybe one of the easiest administrator tasks in Apricot. Simply drag and drop the fields that you'd like to place in the form from the field choices palette into the form itself. Add whatever other details you'd like to the form and publish that Tier 1 form. So this survey, I just have 3 simple questions all on a Likert scale from poor to good, scale of 1 to 3. And on the front end, this looks like any other standard Tier 1 form. We can create new surveys just normally like anything else, like a client intake or a profile, or any other Tier 1 records that you might have. The second step is to create a dummy user for your web form. And by dummy user, I mean it's not going to be used by anyone in your organization. It's specifically used for secure web forms. A dummy user isn't a real user, but rather a placeholder user account for web form access. We recommend creating a dummy user even though this replaces one seat in your Apricot license. We're going to get to that a little bit more in a bit. So you can see here I've already created a new user. You can do that from here. Simply create a user with some generic email address that uses your domain, set a password that will never be used, and I like to name it Web Form Access so I know exactly what it is. Once the user is created, we need to give this user permission to add new records of the survey that I created as a form. And that's done with permission sets. Now, permission sets are created through programs. And I've created a permission set here with view and create only access to the survey. I don't need the ability to search or edit because web forms are only creating the record. Now, unfortunately, I have to select view. That's a requirement. So view and create is my default. I don't need to give them access to anything else. But if I did have other web forms that this user should have access to, I could add those here to give them a singular permission set for adding these records. Once I've got my form, I've got my dummy user, the majority of the build is done. The next step is to go to Apricot settings. Now, some databases do not have this feature active out of the box. There's a checkbox here under the a la carte features section that says secure web forms. Check that box to display this option in the left-hand administrator panel. Once that's done, now I can go to my secure web forms link and I can create the secure web form record. So to do that, I simply create a new record. I can name it, select the form, in this case my survey, select my dummy user, that's web form access. It's going to tell me that this user can view and create, which means that this is a good user for me to use for this form. And then I save the record. Now I already have one of these created, so I'm going to go back here. Show you what this looks like after you create it. Once you publish this secure web form, you get a basic URL and an embed URL. If I go ahead and copy this link, these are the two elements that I can use to deploy my web form on my website or as a standalone link. So I am going to open up another browser tab here and show you my secure web form. So I've opened this up in an incognito browser tab so that my login does not affect the secure web form. And you can see that as an external user, not logged into my database, I can view this web form based on the link that I copied earlier. And that link is right here. So sometimes it's hard to remember where you can get the deployable links for a web form. They're all located in the Secure Web Forms option toolkit here in the left-hand panel of the Administrator tab. Should you want to embed this in an existing page on your website, you can do that with an iframe here, which is different than the direct link, which is here. And again, navigates to this secure web form. So as I mentioned earlier, setting up the web form is straightforward, but there are a few tips and best practices you can use during implementation. With these options, you can turn a standard web form into a productivity and data collection tool and improve the workflow of records coming into your database. We're going to go over a number of best practices, and you can choose one or multiple of these to implement in your secure web form deployments. Your choices really depend on the use case, and we'll go over some use cases after we go through the best practices. So let's start with the first one. So it's a best practice to add email triggers to your secure web form for the new web form submission, the person who submitted the web form record, to receive a notification of success. This would be relevant if you're using an identified, a non-anonymous submission. And in addition to that, to notify a staff member or some internal member of your team of a new entry. This would be relevant for things like applications or referrals or intakes or things of that nature. Now, secure web forms can do more than just notify someone of a successful submission. They can also prompt users with next steps. So the body of an email can be written in order to prompt the next step in the process, whether that's a submission from someone who's submitting an inquiry, and then we're identifying the next step for them to complete an application, or triggering an internal staff member to then take a follow-up step with the new submission. So let's do a quick demo of what this looks like in Apricot. I'm going to go to my secure web form, which is my survey, and I've already added an email trigger field to my form. These are located in the special drop-down of your field choices palette. Simply drag and drop that in. See here. And after you've published the form, you have some options: who you want to send it to, what you want in the body of the email text, how and when you want to send it, and then any attachments. If you are accepting email addresses from the person who is submitting the web form, and you'd like to send an email notification to that person confirming receipt of their submission, you can take the email field that is listed in the web form. So in this case, here's an email field that this web form user would fill out. And we can dynamically place whatever is entered in that email field in the recipient's line. Now, this is done by selecting this fields dropdown and selecting email as a merge field or a merged token. You can do the same thing for user accounts. So if you'd like to send this internally to someone, you can also add this to an internal user. So whether you're notifying the web form user themselves or you're notifying someone internal, you can dynamically populate the recipients of an email trigger based on the submission, which is helpful because then you're not set on a particular email trigger type. Once you've set the recipients, you can add the subject line and you can add the body of the email. Now, similarly to the recipients list, you can also merge in data from the submission if you feel like that's relevant to either the person that's receiving the notification internally or the person who submitted the web form through the form itself. Now, be careful not to put any confidential or client protected data in these, as email is not a secure form of communication. But you can add fields to the body of the email by simply selecting those fields here. When you're all done, hit apply and publish your form. And that's email triggers. Adding email triggers is a best practice for secure web forms. The next best practice is to select an appropriate duplicate check. There's a note of caution here with respect to web forms. Duplicate checks might not act the way that you want them to with secure web forms. So selecting the wrong duplicate check field could limit a web form user from completing a submission, and we don't want that in most cases. We want web form users to have unrestricted access to create new records at any moment. So one of the things that you can do to unlock the ability to create a record regardless of duplicate checking is to set the record ID as the duplicate check. Now, the record ID is always unique, so that means that any submission that comes through the web form will be automatically added to your database. Now, the key here is to focus on the user experience. One thing to keep in mind, sometimes we run into situations where organizations would like to use a client profile as a web form, but the duplicate check is set to, let's say, the name and date of birth. If someone enters a potential duplicate, there's a possibility that the web form user will see the quick view fields associated with that record that is a duplicate match, just like you would in your normal database. This could be a potential issue for protection of client data. And as a result, in most instances, we highly recommend using some unique duplicate checking function in order to ensure that every web form that is submitted automatically goes through and never shows any duplicate data that might already be in the database. It's very simple to do this. You can simply set the record ID as the duplicate check. And in this particular case, with my survey, since I would like surveys from anyone at any time based on when they submit them, I can set the record ID simply as my duplicate check. Next, form logic is highly recommended for web forms. 2 reasons. Number 1, you can streamline the user experience by providing them only the data entry that they need to see based on the conditions of their data. And the second is to validate data entry. So web form users aren't educated in your data standards. You may have user guides for your internal users, and you may be following some strict procedures for how data is entered. Web form users don't have that same training. So because of that, we want to validate data entry so that data quality challenges are minimized. And we can use form logic to do that. Now, there's lots of conditions that we can build into this for streamlining the user experience or validating data entry. But I do want to show you a tip with respect to the record ID as a form logic condition. So the record ID is an interesting form logic condition because there is no record ID when a record is new, meaning it hasn't been saved, but there is a record ID the moment it's saved. So if I click New Survey inside of Apricot, you can see that there's no record ID. The record ID is empty. If I go to an existing record, you can see that the record ID is filled in. This is helpful because for web form users, they will only ever view the web form when the record ID is empty. And internal Apricot users will only ever view the record when the record ID is not empty. So this creates a nice fine line between what you want to show to an end user and what you might want to keep for internal use only on the web form. So let's go through an example. So in this case, I've created a section for instructions. Now, instructions is something that I want to show to web form users, but I do not want to show that to internal users because internal users don't need the instructions. They just need to see the record. So I want to hide it when there's a record ID present, but I want to unhide it when the record ID is empty. So I can simply create a new rule. Record ID is empty. And when the record ID is empty, I want to unhide the section instructions. So now, if I refresh this, every time that a web form user opens this survey, they will see the instructions. Now, if I enter some data here, this is going to be entered into Apricot. So here's my recent entry on 11/28. So if I open this up inside of Apricot, that section is going to remain hidden. Similarly, if we want to unhide sections that might be for internal use only. So if you remember back to some paper forms, we'd have the little boxes at the bottom that would say, do not complete these pieces for internal use only. We might want to do the same thing like this section here. We may only want to show when the record ID is not empty. To go get my secure web form link one more time. So as you can see, the instructions display here, but the internal use only section does not display. So if I go back to my Apricot and I select the record that we just created, this record will not display the instructions, but it will display the internal use only section that we set based on the record ID. So again, this is a great way to differentiate between elements that need to be visible for the end user and elements that need to be visible for your internal team once a submission is complete. The next best practice is to add instructions. So this is adding HTML label fields to your form. There's a couple of things that you need to think about. The first is we recommend including contact information to your form just in case someone has a problem entering the data. The second is that you need to identify the save location for the form. Now, Apricot forms, web forms, are exactly like they are in the database. The Save Record button is up here on the right. It is not at the bottom of the form. This can be confusing to some web form users, and as such, adding instructions at the bottom of the form to scroll up and select Save Record could be helpful. In addition to that, you can also use HTML label fields as alerts. Using form logic, if some element of the data is incorrect or it needs to be completed, you could add alerts that display only when those conditions are true. So throughout the form, you could provide alerts or instructions that only display based on the conditions of data entry. As we talked about earlier, it's a best practice to create a separate dummy user for web forms and create at least one permission per program with view and create only access. This is primarily a security recommendation. Using an internal user is not recommended. Even though this requires an additional login or user seat, we do recommend having a separate web form user as a dummy user for this purpose. We also recommend creating data quality reports for the submissions. So this might be a submission queue that's based on submissions this month or this week. You can also set up email triggers to review submissions one by one. Basically, what we need to confirm is that data entry is complete, data entry was done accurately, and that's best done either in bulk on a consistent schedule, like creation date is this week or this month, or to do them as they come in if they're things like applications or inquiries. And those can be done with simple email triggers. So our webinar title said that I was only going to give you 6 tips, but I could not stop. So I'm going to give you 2 bonuses because we're really excited about secure web forms. So here we go. 2 more. The first bonus is to link secure web form submissions to a profile. So we often get the question, what happens if I have my secure web form as a client profile and someone needs to come to the organization more than once via a referral or an application or some other form? I can't create another client profile because the client profile already exists. So in that case, what we recommend is having a separate tier 1 form for the application, referral, whatever the use case is. And for each submission, process those submissions by linking them to the associated profile or creating a new one. So this can be done, again, like we talked about, with an internal use only style section. And the good news is that we can then correlate the submission through the web form with the profile. So the submission kind of acts like a tier 2 form for the profile. We're linking to the profile. We can link many of these secure web forms to the profile. Therefore, a web form user can enter multiple records per associated profile, and that way we can report on them. So let's go ahead and take a look at a demo of this. So in my database, I've already created this solution where, whoops, maybe I'll select the one from today. Where we have this section here. So every survey that comes in, let's say this is not, it's an identified survey, it's not anonymous. I can simply search for an existing client profile, or I can create a new client profile to link to this. So let's go ahead and link this to test tester. And now I've coupled that survey with this test tester account. Now I've set up the linking field such that I can only link one client per survey, but I can have many surveys per client. And that's done with the linking field settings in my form of one to many. So this solution is best for things like applications, referrals, inquiries, intakes, anything that might happen more than once per client, but that you need to report on by client. You can make that linking association. The last bonus, again, I'm only giving you 2, is the submission report. So we recommend building reports before you even start with web forms. Meaning before you deploy the web form, before you start collecting submissions, get a report in place so you can start seeing the submissions come through in real time. One way to do this is with a submission report. You can set global values in a date range, you can show graphs, you can do one section per question, and you can group by response. These are really easy to set up. Once you do the first section of the report, the rest are basically copies. So I'm going to go ahead and open my survey report, and I've already created global values for a start date and an end date. I'll show you how these work in a second. I've set up a total number of submissions in the date range. I've got a total of 8. And then I'm adding a section per question. So here's question 1, I'm grouping by the question. Question 2, I'm grouping by the question. And if I want to continue down this with many more questions that I have in the survey, I can simply copy the section, change the question that I'm grouping by, group by that question, And now my report's all set up. The filter carries through, the form structure carries through, the chart carries through, and all I have to do is change the question. This is relevant for most secure web forms. Again, once you create the first section, which I've done up here for question 1, I can copy it for all of my additional questions on the web form. So now when I publish this report, I have my global values. You can see my results. This is for September, but let's say I want to do this for November, my one submission in November. Change the date range. And you can see I only have one, but that carries through the whole report. So this type of structure is relevant for a submission report or a data quality report or any other type of report that you want to build based on web form data. So with these best practices in mind, when should we use secure web forms? I've talked a little bit about applications and referrals and some other options. We've even shown you surveys. But what are the use cases? When can you use them? And what are some of the tips that you can implement or structures that you can implement for those web forms? Ultimately, we're trying to streamline processes. So that's where these use cases come from. So there's multiple ways to use secure web forms. We've narrowed this presentation down to 7, and they're listed here. To make these tangible and practical and more or less implementation ready for you, we're going to go over some key features of each and how we've implemented them in the past and how we look at each one in terms of implementation to provide for the best possible user experience. So let's start with surveys. So with surveys, you can use web forms to replace or supplement existing survey tools. Apricot comes with this capability out of the box. It's included in every license, and you can set up surveys as needed with a variety of field choices in Apricot. We can collect qualitative and or quantitative data using surveys. And depending on how we'd like the survey to work, we can receive anonymous or identified submissions. And that choice is up to you. Referrals is another use case. It's a very common use case. Provide a link to your community partners. Reduce the amount of paper that's coming to you. Give them a web form that they can fill out when they have a new referral. During implementation, make sure that you set up an internal email notification for approvals or reviews. That can go to a program manager. That can go to an intake manager. It could go to some other user who is responsible for filtering through those submissions. You can require complete submissions with form logic validation, and we would also recommend linking referrals to a client profile using the best practice we talked about earlier. Inquiries or contact us forms are another use for secure web forms. These can be used for screening applicants before you create an application profile or intake. It can be a first step. Make sure to send internal notifications to staff members for follow-up. And if someone matches a certain criteria, you could automate an email trigger to send that person the next step, like the link to the application form, with that email trigger. So you can create workflows with email triggers and secure web forms to continue the process. After an inquiry or a contact us, or even before or without an inquiry, we can also do applications, profiles, and intake. You can provide a link on your website, or it can be in an automated reply to inquiries, or it can be a page that you keep for specific purposes. You can gather contact information and demographic data, all of which can be linked to a profile. You can also queue submissions for review and approval. That can be done in a report, could be done in a bulletin dashboard on the home screen, could also be done with email triggers. Registrations are another unique use case. This could be registrations for events, workshops, classes, any other cohort or group settings that you might have. You can provide a link to potential attendees, and you can allow people to select a date and time from a list of options, which is really intriguing because then you can generate real-time rosters with reports. If you're setting up reports before you deploy your web form, you can watch your rosters roll in automatically. Another use case is activity logs. You can gather activity logs from volunteers or participants or mentors. You can provide that data entry portal so that they can add multiple logs over time, or you could also provide a secure web form with the ability to submit an import file. So say they're tracking things in Excel. You could have them submit the import file, download it, and import it into Apricot. If you use an activity log format, you will want to use the link of a web form to a profile, and you'll want to queue those up and make that for each submission. So a couple of these use cases, as you can identify, need to be linked to some kind of profile because they're not anonymous. And that is what we found is the best way to link and correlate that data in Apricot, still reducing the amount of time on data entry on your side because you only have to do the link instead of entering the full record. But it does create that correlation so you can make the connection and reports. And then the last one is for support or report requests. Now, you can provide this link to community partners, funders, or staff. You can request text-based narrative descriptions of reports, and you can manage your queue based on priorities. If there are people who in your organization that do not have access to Apricot to log in, you can simply have some external portal where they can submit requests to you for technical assistance or reports, which then an administrator can process, queue up, and complete. We've actually built a number of these help desk style systems in Apricot. Most of the time they come with a number of email triggers to notify people when things have been moved or changed, and can adjust priority accordingly. So as you can see, the potential use cases for Apricot Secure Web Forms are quite extensive. As you move to implementation of any of these use cases, with the best practices that we've talked about, there are 4 things that you'll want to consider. So the first one is that secure web forms are only available for Tier 1 forms. Now, we can get around this with linking to a client profile from the secure web form. If there is some kind of multiple relationship between a profile and the web form submissions. But you cannot create a Tier 2 secure web form as of now. The second is don't add links for web form end user data entry. So don't provide linking fields to end users, the web form users, to enter when they're completing a submission. There's some gray area here. But in most cases, linking fields will not display for the end user, things like wizard links. So it's a best practice to stay away from linking fields. Also, the data entry is somewhat confusing for end users who have never seen Apricot. The third one is that the look and feel of any Apricot web form matches the Apricot user experience. You can see that this looks very much like an Apricot form. This cannot be customized. If that's an issue, you may need to look for alternatives. And then the last one is that many web forms now come with the ability to step through a series of questions. maybe only displaying new questions when earlier questions have been answered. You can use sections and form logic, so the sections here, these things that I'm collapsing, to step users through a workflow by, let's say, triggering the next section when the final question in the section is completed. So when this is complete, open up section 2. When this is complete, open up section 3, so on and so forth. But web forms aren't a fit in every scenario. So with those considerations in mind, here's 2 alternatives to consider. The first one is guest login. If you need users, let's say volunteers, mentors, funders, grant applicants, if you're using Apricot for funders, if you need them to enter Tier 1 and Tier 2 forms, not just a single use Tier 1 form, guest login might be a fit. So guest login gives basically a watered down version of Apricot for users to log in just like a normal user and engage with your forms more organically. Tier 2s are available, Tier 1s are available. You can even show them reports and dashboards. This is restricted access, so you're not giving them total access to the whole database. And you can use the user RLA to restrict their access to only records they create. So let's quickly go over user record level access is available in permission sets. If you're using guest record level access, user RLA comes into play quite a bit. That's this button right here. Another alternative is to use a web form software in an import. So you can collect entries in another software. Some options are listed here. You can export that data to Excel and you can import into Apricot. Now, the top one is probably curious to you. Apricot, really? We can use that as an alternative to web forms and import. That might not make a lot of sense, but this does happen in situations where you want to make secure web form entries a Tier 2 record under a Tier 1 profile. We can add a secure web form, export the data, organize it, duplicate check it, and import it to a Tier 2. This is actually something we've implemented before, and it's a solution that can work pretty well. So with the best practices, use cases, alternatives, options, all this stuff we've talked about today, how do you implement the right solution for your organization? While there's a lot to think about, we've talked about a lot today, we recommend focusing on 3 keys. Number 1, focus on user experience. That should drive all of your decisions with respect to secure web form implementation. The second is form logic is recommended. If you don't have form logic now, it's a feature you should take a look at adding because it can significantly enhance not only data quality, but also user experience of a web form. And the last one is to build workflow and submission reports up front. Before you ever collect a submission from a survey or get a referral or an application or an inquiry or any type of web form, make sure that you've got the reports up front so you can see that data coming in. Visibility to your data is critical for web forms. So that's our third takeaway. So I hope you'll take these with you when you start implementing secure web forms. And this concludes today's presentation. So a quick note about our company and what we do. If you enjoyed today's presentation and our approach to Apricot software, let's find some time to connect. I'd love to learn more about your organization, see if working on your Apricot is a good fit, and if a consulting engagement would be worthwhile to you. Our door is always open. You can certainly contact us on our website. You can respond to any emails we send you after this webinar with the recording and the slides. And keep us in mind next time you have questions about Apricot. So I appreciate everyone attending today. Appreciate your interest and engagement. So let's open up some time for questions. So we have a question here. Two questions relating to web form access and the dummy user. So is there any way to get around making a separate user for web form access if you do not have any seats left? So you can't create a dummy user without having a seat available. So no, there's no way to get around that. And there's some gray area, but we really recommend having a separate account for web form users just as a security provision. In addition, one of the things that happens with a web form submission is that it gets stamped with the user ID. And if you add the web form access as one of your users, it will look as if that person entered all of those records. And sometimes that can be a data quality issue, especially if you're running data quality or some other report type based on the created by field. Another question about this same topic: do you need a separate username for each type of secure web form that is being used? No, you can use one web form user for all of them, but that web form user may have multiple permission sets depending on where the forms are located in your programs. So another question related to the copying of reports that we talked about earlier. Can you copy reports and change a filter rather than recreating it from scratch? Yes. However, you have to be somewhat careful. Sometimes filters can break if you're using global values or if you're using some set determined value. So you do have to pay attention to that. You may have to rebuild your filters, but I can simply copy this section here. And let's call this question, or how about created by? So I copied this whole report, and I can add new filters. Whoops, let me add the field first. So I only want to see the ones created by me. And that changes the results of the report. Another question, which is a good one, and comes up a lot because web forms, we're attempting to streamline data entry and make things easier. So do we have to link each tier 1 manually to a client profile? So again, this is a potential use case when we're talking about referrals, applications, things that might happen multiple times per client or per profile. Yes, you do have to link them manually. You could complete an import of the linking field to make those links. But the way I like to think about the linking field is I like to think about the linking field as a processing step. So every record web form submission that does not have the linking field complete is in queue. And I would build a report that shows all of those that do not have the linked record. Those are the ones that need to be addressed. And that report, ongoing, the goal should be to have 0 records in that report. Because once they've been processed, they'll fall out of that report. Now, my opinion is that in order to improve reporting potential, which making the link does improve reporting potential because you can correlate the 2 records together in a single section as opposed to dealing with them separately or pivoting in Excel or doing some other analysis outside of Apricot. The process of processing those records and making the link is a small concession, given that we're allowing complete data entry in the web form, identifying when we need to address and process a new submission, and we get the full reporting potential. So yes, you do have to make that link manually. You can do it via import. There are some ways to do that, but it is a manual linking process. So that's the end of our questions list for right now. If there are any other questions, please go ahead and send those through. We'll stay on for a few minutes and see if there are any others. And you're welcome to leave at any point or stay on to ask questions or hear what others are wondering about. Great. Well, it looks like there may be no more questions, so we'll go ahead and close down for today. I'm going to be sending an email with a recording of the presentation and the slides. Should you have any additional questions, feel free to send those through via email, and we'd love to see you on the other side. Thank you again. Have a great day.